Hey everyone, and welcome to this video. I'm Glenn, and this is episode 17 of the Oathsworn painting series. In this episode, I'm painting the Forgotten King. If you're new to miniature painting, I hope you find this video interesting and helpful. If you enjoy what I do, please hit the like button and leave a comment. As usual, let's see how I painted this pet enthusiast. Let's begin. First, I removed all the mold lines by using a hobby knife and filled the gaps by using the mixed sprue glue. Once the glue dried, I washed and cleaned the models in soapy water, rinsed them in clean water and let them dry. Then I primed the models white using an airbrush. This can also be applied by using a can of white primer. Now we're all set and good to go. I begin the painting process by base coating the bases using the method from previous videos. This time I aim for rich green tones and apply the paints in a random manner to give the bases a natural organic feel. If you're interested in more details about the process, I can recommend watching episode 3. You should be able to find the timestamp in the description of that video. On these bases, I mix orc skin and moonlit coral to create a grey color. I use this technique for the shadowed areas of the models. Here is a brief look of the different bases. Next I move on to the models using a similar process as I did on the bases, with the colors shown in the banners. These are applied somewhat randomly to keep the organic feel. As mentioned, I mix orc skin and moonlit coral to create a grey tone, which I apply in the shadows or in the areas where I want a darker tone of either purple or green depending on the ratio. I aim for purple, green and brown tones onto the armor and body parts. On the Loin cloth, I use a mix of brown and green. While for the quiver, I use a similar mix, but with more brown to it. For the arrows, I also incorporate yellow to make them stand out. On the rest of the body, I use the green and purple mix for the shadows and transition to lighter tones as I work towards the top. I went over the quiver again to add more saturation. On the bow I apply the green and purple mix, avoiding the areas with the entangled amber. I add some purple areas for flavor. And use yellow on the entangled amber, including the tip. With the base coat complete, the models look something like this. I use this process on the hounds as well, with a focus on green, brown and purple tones, as on the body and armor on the king. For the hawk I aimed for a more earthy green tone on the wings, and for the body I use brown, green and purple tones. With the ugly face complete, it's time to start layering the white areas using the colors shown on the banners. This process is applied to all the white areas across all the models. I use the artwork as a reference. In general, I focus on painting the raised areas and edges using desaturated brown, green and grey. All these colors are mixed with bone white. Depending on the placement, more pure colors can also be used to add contrast. I alternate between these three colors, applying them thinly as semi-transparent layers. As I build up the layers, they become more opaque. Next I switch to pure bone white, applying it in thin layers as well. For the final layer I use Oathsworn Grey, and here I also incorporate the stippling technique. Once I'm satisfied with the layering, I glaze the shadows with Moonlake Coral to add color depth. Afterward, I clean up with Bone White and Oathsworn Grey. In selected spots on the white areas, I decided to paint green spots using a mix of green and yellow. I gradually layer these spots from green to light yellow for a smooth transition. While painting the white areas, I decided to change the underpainting on the head of this model by using green and yellow. Afterward, I applied the same layering process to achieve the white area effect on top, allowing a subtle green tone to show through. This demonstrates that if you're not satisfied with any area, it is possible to adjust it. Keeping this in mind, you can experiment and put whatever color you like underneath the white area, following the same process to get the desired effect. Moving on to the green areas on the models, I use the colors shown on the banners. The green areas are the body parts between the white areas. This process is applied to all the green areas across all the models. For the most part, I work with green and yellow, using a layering process to gradually build up the highlights by adding more yellow to the mix. I also incorporate bone white and a mix of yellow and Oathsworn grey for the final highlights. I use Moon Lake Coral as a shade. Keep in mind when applying purple speed paint over yellow areas, it can turn orange. To correct this, I simply applied brown on top. Here I'm finishing up the hounds, applying the final touch of purple shade in the shadows. I will revisit the white areas and the eyes later. Before we return to the king and finish him up, let's catch the bird up to speed. I will only cover the feathers, as the branches along the wings leading edge, the body and the lower leg section, including the claws, are painted using the same process as the white areas, and the upper leg section is painted in the same manner as the green areas. With that aside, I start briefly layering the feathers with Loin forest, aiming for an earthy green look. Next I follow up with a lighter mix, applying it by dry brushing to capture the edges and raised areas. This technique is used on all the feathers, on top and underneath. I then highlight the central edge of each feather on top. Now I gradually lightening up the tips to create contrast. This step is applied to both sides, with bone white being used for the underside of the feathers. After that, I apply a mix of brown and green speed paints on the feathers, pulling the mix from the tip towards the base of the feathers to enhance contrast. I then refine the feathers again, focusing on the tips and the edges with Oathsworn grey on top and bone white underneath. I chose to leave the feathers slightly dark to create a strong contrast with the branches on the wings when I refined them later. Now let's get back to the king and finish him up. For his torso and the branches on his back, I used the same techniques as for the white and green areas, blending these two techniques together. I use all the colors on the banners. I start by applying the white area effects to the chest and the green area effects to the stomach. As I move around his sides, I blend the two techniques, alternating between the different colors previously used. I apply shades of purple to the less exposed areas to add depth. Continuing around the body, I blend the techniques, and on the branches as well. I use a light green mix to add color and transitions. This is applied thinly. The combination of the white and green areas along with the purple shades creates a great effect. For the crown, I use the white area technique, applying the colors shown on the banners. To complete the crown, I apply a shade of purple for added depth and contrast. On the hair, I already have a nice greenish underpainting. I then go straight to bone white and begin a layering process. I follow up with a light yellow, highlighting the raised areas and edges. Here I add more Oathsworn Grey into the mix. And finish with a mix of yellow and green, aiming for the recesses. On the Loin cloth, I begin with bone white, layering the exposed areas and edges. And use a green and yellow mix to paint the small dots. Afterward, I gradually highlight them with yellow and Oathsworn Grey. To finish it up, I add a shade of purple. For the fletching on the arrow, I use tones of green and yellow and mix Oathsworn grey into yellow for the fine highlights. It's similar to what I just did on the hair. I paint the arrow shaft brown, then add wood grain details using a mix of Stylian drab and bone white. I follow up with another layer of wood grain lines using bone white. To blend everything together, I apply a thin coat of Mournfang brown over the shaft. On the bow, I use the white area technique. The only differences are that I paint some textures on the flat surfaces using the same colors, by applying thin lines. After applying purple to the shadows, I add more green spots to the bow and highlight these areas with a light mix of yellow. At this stage, I decided to enhance the white areas by using pure white. I applied it thinly to the most exposed and raised areas on all the models. This really made those areas stand out. Painting the eyes, I started with white, applying this to all the eyes. Next, I applied a small amount of plasmatic bolt. Then I went back in with white, narrowing down the eyes. Here I also went a bit back and forth between plasmatic bolt and white, to refine the eyes and create a glowing effect. I paint the quiver using tones of green and yellow, gradually building up the layers by incorporating more yellow. On the decoration around the quiver, I applied the white area technique. The arrows in the quiver were painted just like the one ready on the bow to impale an Oathsworn. With the models complete, let's move on to the king's beating stick. For the sword, I use the colors shown on the banners. I start by applying yellow, orange and brown speed paint in a somewhat random manner, creating areas of light and dark. For the straps, I use a mix of green and brown. Once the speed paint is dry, I add another thin coat to boost saturation. I'm not too worried about precision here, just aiming for a nice coverage with a bit of variation. Next, I begin highlighting the sword using yellow and white, focusing on the edges and the small scratches. I also add texture to the flat areas of the blade using the stippling technique, aiming for a sporadic pattern. If any areas get too bright or mistakes happen, it is easy to backtrack by reapplying Speedpaint for depth and gradient. For the most part, when adding gradients with Speedpaint, I use Fire Giant Orange. You will notice a back and forth between adding gradients with Speedpaint and building up texture throughout this process. In selected areas, I increase the brightness with white. While in other areas I find too dark, I apply a touch of yellow. And follow up with a layer of Speedpaint to add gradient. Afterwards, I apply texture on top. At this stage, I have added texture and Speedpaint for gradients multiple times on this blade edge. I apply the same process to the other blade edge, building up the layers and texture. And adding white as a highlight. I then use a thin mix of orange and brown, just a small amount, to add depth and gradient. Next, I add more texture using tones of white and yellow. Here I also decided to build a brighter area, starting with yellow and gradually brightening it up. Then I followed up with Speedpaint to create a nice gradient. And follow up with more texture on top. This is a back and forth process, applying a thin layer of Speedpaint and adding texture. Doing this multiple times creates depth and a textured effect. At this stage I have applied the process multiple times on both blade edges. Here I add white as a highlight and decide the brightest areas. After a night's sleep, I felt the sword was too bright for the amber look I was going for. To tone this down, I applied a thin layer of brown. As the final touch, I add small dots of brown, and you guessed it, for more texture. This entire process is applied to all the amber areas on the sword. So, to sum it up, I base coated the sword randomly with tones of yellow, orange and brown. I then layered and highlighted it with tones of yellow and white to create texture. I used a bit of Speedpaint for added depth and gradient. Afterwards, I followed up with more texture. The key here is the layering process, going back and forth between Speedpaint layers and added textures. In some areas, this process was applied more than twice. Next, I applied a thin layer of brown Speedpaint for a darker finish and added small dots for extra detail. I used a picture of real amber for reference, aiming to replicate its variety of colors and saturation, as amber can appear both light and dark. Let me know in the comments if you think the sword looks like amber or something else. The amber entangle in the bow was painted using the same process, including the tip. And the straps received layers and highlights with tones of green and yellow. I layer and highlight the bases as I have done in previous videos, using tones of yellow, green, brown and grey. I also painted small dots on the bases in tones of purple and blue. For the tree stumps, I brightened them up with the desaturated colors, followed by randomly dabbing on bone white with a sponge. Next, I apply a light green mix or the desaturated colors to these areas, creating a nice textured effect. This process was applied twice to enhance the texture. I also add purple and brown for shades. For further detail, I add orange spots as if something is blossoming from the tree stumps, starting with brown applied with a sponge. Then I use the sponge again with a mix of brown and yellow. Next, I alternate between stippling on tones of yellow and white, followed up by a glaze of orange. I do this multiple times, gradually using a brighter yellow in between the orange glaze. Then I go the 2 laps around the base rim with a black color. I attach tufts, leaves, flowers and plants to the bases using super glue. And then I gave the models a coat of matte varnish for a matte finish and to protect the paints. And with that, let's have a look at the final result.
Accursed creatures stand at our gates, and the Painting Chronicles Brotherhood stands at the ready to face this evil. Join our cause by subscribing, and we shall triumph together. Pillar and Path Brothers. Also like and comment.